Good morning, everyone. My name is Martisiute. I'm a policy analyst here in Brussels at the European Policy Centre, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this online policy dialogue dedicated to assessing the strategic significance of Greenland to the European and Euro-Atlantic security. This event is organised in the scope of BC's Northern Europe Platform, or NEP for short, which aims to reflect the increasing relevance of Europe's Nordic, Arctic and Baltic front lines and give visibility to matters and developments that threaten the integrity and security of this vast region. And if you want to learn more about it, just reach out to me and I will gladly follow it up with you. We have today wonderful four speakers with whom we will delve into the question of Greenland in terms of what it means to European defense and security. We all know that the High North has historically played a geostrategic role when it comes to the Arctic, Canada and US security, but has been traditionally off the agendas of EU and NATO. And it seems that this now has changed. In view of Trump's repeated threats to annex the island and Denmark's repeated rejections of Trump's demands, Greenland and the wider Arctic has taken center stage in European and international politics. And the objective of today's exchange is simply to unpack and assess the rapidly changing developments surrounding Greenland from the perspective of the US, Denmark, Greenland, and Sweden. We will examine implications for European security. We will try to look forward into the future and offer recommendations for regional stability. And so to discuss these matters, I would like to briefly introduce our four speakers. First, it's Nauja Bianco. She's an independent consultant and board member of Greenland Resources. Rennéus Guthrie, director at Stockholm Frivärld Forum in Sweden. Jonas Parello-Plesner, executive director of Alliance of Democracies Foundation in Denmark. And Kremidas-Courtney, a distinguished expert in defense and security, EPC senior visiting fellow. Thank you all very much for taking your time and making the effort to be here today on this important question. Just a quick message to the audience. As you follow the debate, you're most welcome to put your questions or comments in the Q&A icon here at the very bottom. As we speak, I will try to integrate your comments, observations, and questions so that it's not only me triggering and putting forward questions, but you are most welcome to do that throughout this conversation. And also to the speakers, as you speak, feel free to raise your hand if you would like to come in. You don't need to wait for me to trigger or come with the next question. If you would like to come in after one of your fellow panelists, you're most welcome to do so. Just please raise your hand. So to start with, I would like to kickstart the discussion with you, Chris. It seems that the question of Greenland has largely disappeared from media headlines. And we all know that the US, Greenland, and Denmark are probably busy still trying to reach some kind of compromise on the question. But I was wondering whether the US position of acquiring Greenland has materially changed. Has Washington perhaps backpedaled on its plan to take Greenland? What's your view? Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Maria, and it's great to join you. It's hard to believe that we're only 3 months into 2026. It's been an exhausting time with everything from Venezuela to Greenland to Iran and everything in between. So I think, obviously starting the year off with President Trump making military threats against an ally in Denmark is not the way you want to start the year, and not the way any of us wants to start or finish the year. So I think a few things here. One is it's hard to know where Trump and his friends' financial interests and U.S. government interests begin. And let me unpackage that, because I think what we're seeing in a lot of these interactions is sort of a merger of state and private interests. And so let's think about this man, Ron Lauder, who in 2018 convinced Trump, hey, we should, buy into Greenland. Let's see if we could buy Greenland, right? The United States has tried this several times, and every time Denmark says, no, thank you. And so Ron Lauder, who at the same time was buying up all kinds of interest in Greenland, is trying to convince Trump, hey, let's make a go for Greenland. Let's try to buy it. And that was promptly squashed back then. It's resurfaced since then, and since that time, Ron Lauder and similar people have been making investments in Greenland now, in particular seeking rare earth minerals and other things. That same group that includes Ron Lauder has also been part of the cabal who was seeking mineral rights and trying to strong arm President Zelensky in Ukraine. So it's Greenland to me is also part of a larger pattern of this sort of merger between state and private interests in U.S. foreign policy. So. I think we have, and this week there's a great article in the New York Times that was sort of, passing along some Danish reporting on, private U.S. actors moving around in Greenland, dreams of hydroelectric powered data centers and all kinds of things that you could probably read in there. And again, with Trump, it's hard to know if he treats everything like a real estate deal. So it's hard to know if he's just making maximalist demands as a negotiating tactic. But the corrosive effects on the alliance cannot be overstated. I think that's one thing that's important. We've also seen reports of sort of plans to buy the votes of Greenlanders and whatnot. A couple things here. Obviously, the U.S. has valid concerns about rare earth minerals since China controls a vast majority of them in the world. China did have a contract apparently to get access to some rare earth minerals in Greenland. They're low grade, they're difficult to extract. I think any reasonable observer would say nothing to be scared about. And the craziest part is, even if that was a U.S. company that had those rights in Greenland to take some rare earth minerals from Greenland, they still have to send them to China to process all of them, right? The United States doesn't have the ability to process most of these. So, a couple of crazy things here. So I think a few things. One, you're also hearing, I think this is also part of a broader view from the White House and from Trump himself. You're hearing him talk about manifest destiny again. That's something you don't hear. You don't really talk about that since maybe high school history class, which was this idea in the 1800s that the United States had a divine right to expand. So you hear him talking about that kind of language, obviously concerning for anyone in the neighborhood. But I think the current quagmire in Iran, he's sort of gotten himself stuck in Iran. It's causing, he's bleeding internal political support. The MAGA ecosystem inside the United States is splitting. So I think, in the very near future, I think my deepest belief is that after Iran, he wants to move on to Cuba, and after Cuba, they'll circle back to Greenland. I think on the defense, let me just cover the defense parts really quickly before I hand it back over. I'm sorry for going so long. But I think on the defense concerns, the U.S. has concerns about missile defense, but, I've read the 1951 agreement twice, and I've read more than a few U.S. bilateral defense agreements. And this one is so generous. It is so open. It's hard to see what more you can get. I mean, and Denmark and the U.S. have always been very good cooperatively on defense. And so it's hard to see what more they could ask for. But right now, but in this light, any expansion of U.S. presence there now would be more difficult to achieve, since now it carries this threat of U.S. aggression, and so it puts Denmark in a very difficult position. I also think I'll finish off with where you started, Maria, and that is I think NATO's response had a deterrent effect on the White House. I think definitely deploying NATO troops there had the desired deterrent effect. But I think they may need to keep a rotational force there or something, probably for the rest of Trump's term, because I think they'll come back to this, and I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Chris. So many good points. I loved how you started, by connecting the state and private interest, the fact that potentially this is a recurrent issue. It's interesting that you see, America is busy now in Iran, but perhaps it will turn to Cuba, but then come back to Greenland. So there might be much more that might come in the future. And it's indeed hard to tell why this is now off kind of the media headlines. Has it indeed been NATO's response? Has it been perhaps domestic politics in America? But I'd like to turn now to our Danish representative, Jonas. Denmark has been one of the best and most loyal allies of the United States of America. And Chris just referred to a very comprehensive and generous defense agreement that you had since 1950s. And indeed, I think, had Trump come forward to you, and Greenland and say, look, I think there are certain risks, certain threats, or maybe we would like to strike some kind of deal. I'm interested in this economic possibility or that. I think Denmark and Greenland would have been open, right, to exploring in a structured, constructive way some kind of cooperation. But as Chris said, you were put in a very difficult situation because you suddenly found an ally threatening your territorial integrity, but also your sovereignty, and threatening military action. Copenhagen has taken it seriously, and where does Denmark stand today? How do you see it today? And what would be your message when it comes to your fellow Europeans? What are you learning from this experience?
Well, thank you, and thank you for letting me join. It's both also very deeply personal for me. I mean, I've worked in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs before this post for many years. So I was also heading the Foreign and Security Policy Department at the embassy in Washington for years. So I've been sort of used to the sort of strong security cooperation. I think my first point would be that seismic shift that has happened in Denmark, in the Kingdom of Denmark. Nauja can, of course, speak a little bit more than me for the Greenlandic population. But I mean, 60% now in some of the polls here at the start of the year see the US as an adversary, which is like a complete reversal of how we've been classically and transatlantically. The organization that I head, the Alliance of Democracy Foundation, has chairman Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, and also former Danish Prime Minister. Our aim has always been to anchor an alliance of democracies around the US, and with our sort of strong connections there. So also personally, it's been a quite a big seismic change. So, but you see that really in the polling. Then second, on what's going on right now. So behind the headlines, what's happening right now is these trilateral negotiations. So which was sort of, which we joke with in Denmark, this is our killer weapon, the working group that we offered the Americans, a working group. When our foreign minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, and the Greenlandic foreign minister were meeting with Secretary Rubio and Vice President Vance in the White House earlier. So that's sort of been the outcome of that. I think, of course, people hope that out of that could come some sort of, agreement that could also potentially pacify President Trump. But I would say the verdict is out there. Also, with I think everything Chris just laid out is very cogent. On having spent many years myself in Washington D.C., there is now this very strong mix between private interest, between sort of what's government interest, and that sort of dates back to part of the first period, but is really prevalent now in the second period as part of sort of U.S. Foreign policy. So hard to know whether any kind of classical kind of negotiation could really sort of sad, which leads to my third point, which is that in reality, everything before was already sort of on the table and they're open for negotiation. If we look at sort of different buckets, security, the US used to have during the Cold War more than 10 bases with thousands of personnel stations. It's been the US decision within the remits of the 1951 defense agreement between the Kingdom of Denmark and the US to basically draw down that and mainly now have the Pituffik base, which is used for sort of course, elements of missile launch monitoring, and also part of the Space Command that's up there. So that's by now a small base with a couple of hundred US soldiers. So again, it would be completely possible to reopen that and talk about that. So that was also possible before, I think, which is also why Danes and inside the sort of the government system were so dumbfounded by Trump's demands, because they're like, well, if you're concerned about Russia and China, And so are we, which is why the Danes have sort of upped Arctic defense with over 5 billion over the last sort of the last period. So we actually, in a sense, completely share that, and don't think Trump is wrong about pointing out both Russia's military and China's particularly economic interest in the Arctic. We've also seen that in the Arctic Council. So, but again, all of that could have been negotiated. Of course, now a lot of trust has been broken. The second bucket is, of course, the resources. And again, and Nauja that works and have advised in that field can expand even more. But at least from my point of view, from my visits to Greenland and talks, I was particularly tracking then in a think tank, sort of China in Greenland in the early tens. And it was also out of that the Greenlanders tried for a long time, both to get, of course, Danes, but also Americans and others to invest more in Greenland in the mining sector. And nobody was really willing to do it, partly also because on market terms, it's a hard bet, because we have the Chinese that of course have a stronghold on rare earths, both on the processing and part of the mining, and therefore do it very, very cheaply. So it just didn't happen. So when Trump was suddenly, oh, we should have kind of part of the resources, one, of course, it sounded like an offense to the Greenlanders, talking at it as if it wouldn't be something that was part of a deal. But I think from the Greenlandic side, which with the current arrangement have sort of the main say when it comes to the underground and resources, they would have been happy to see more American companies sort of invest, and could still be the outcome of this. And I think there would have been a much greater openness, of course, had you started there rather than started by offending the Greenlandic people and talking about Greenland as a sheet of ice that you can buy. So and that's of course to my final point in that is, like, since now the sovereignty issue has been put so hard on, it of course makes the negotiations on the two other buckets more difficult, because are we now also kind of willing to accommodate the US both on security and resources if we're kind of still worried about, is number 3 still in play, that basically this completely challenges the sovereignty of the Kingdom of Denmark. So that leads, maybe final point, just beyond the Europeans, which I think why we in Denmark overall were quite happy with see both NATO member countries sort of join those exercises. I also want to be, even though I'm no longer a diplomat, of course, also underline that those were not completely only directed against it. There are already exercises in the Arctic, so they were also in line with sort of continuing NATO that have been expanding its Arctic presence. So it coincided well, we can say, with also sending a kind of a double signal. The same comes to the EU side, of course. We never got it tested, but there seemed to be a strong willingness on the sanction side when President Trump announced sanctions on 8 European countries, that the EU would take it on as a joint cause. There could also have been splits, I could see on this, so we didn't get tested on it, but at least the public messages that were sent from some of the main European leaders were quite sort of encouraging for Denmark. But it does leave us in completely new terrain for the first time. The Kingdom of Denmark in 80 years since the Second World War, we're basically threatened from the east and the west. In the east, we of course have the island of Bornholm, close to Russia's enclave in Kaliningrad, and to the west now, a sort of, if we again put it diplomatically, a sort of very strong feeling of unpredictability about it with our strongest ally, the US.
Thank you, Jonas. I like how you made a distinction between, defense aspect and wanting more security or defense in Greenland, but also resources. And then, sovereignty and control is a completely different matter. And how hard it must be now for your fellow compatriots to negotiate when at this stage you probably even wonder, do we want US there in the first place, and to what extent? And for me, reportedly, the fact that Denmark was prepared to fight for Greenland reflects the seriousness of the situation, because there are emerging reports how Denmark, potentially was prepared to blow up airport runaways, and whether, the NATO's exercise was also disguised as a way to, lure the allies and prepare for something major. if the US invaded. And I think I have a lot of respect for these options that Denmark and Greenland have chosen, because I think, and hopefully, it delivered a very powerful message to the US, but also fellow adversaries beyond the US. I'd like to now turn to Nauja. Nauja, such a pleasure to have you, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation. You're a native Greenlander. You've been born and raised in the capital Nuuk. Thank you for joining us. The pressure on Greenland has been enormous, and it continues to be enormous. And I still have this image of your foreign minister and the Danish minister, standing smoking cigarettes in Washington, and just their faces, so serious, worried, and the emotion. I just wanted to ask you, what do people in Greenland think? And how do people feel? Do you feel safe? Do you feel respected as a fellow, part of Denmark, but also an ally within NATO alliance? If you could share that a little bit, I'd be grateful.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Maria, for inviting me to join this session today. I think it's important for the world to know more about the case of Greenland, the case of Greenland, and especially obviously in a European context where I think we might need to look for some solutions. But let's get back to that at a later stage. So the questions you're asking me is actually, they're quite complex. I'll try to address it from a 5-point angle. First of all, I'd like to just stress the legal framework that covers the Kingdom of Denmark, including Greenland. That's the first point. And then I'll jump to, how does the Greenlandic population actually look at this situation? And after that, I'll jump into, how does the political landscape in Greenland look like when it comes to this specific question? And then I think we can't avoid coming back to that whole state and private interest merger that's been talked about already. And then finally, as a 5th point, I'd like to look into what can the EU or Europe do in that context. So when you look at Greenland and the legal framework that covers Greenland, specifically with regards to foreign security and defense policy, this is really a matter of Denmark. So the country of Denmark and not the country of Greenland, because the Constitution states that Greenland cannot be responsible for foreign policy, security policy, and defense policy. That is really a responsibility of the state, which in this case is Denmark. That doesn't mean that Greenland doesn't have anything to say with regards to specifically foreign policy. And that has really been a capacity and a competence and a, if you will, responsibility that's been built up since the 70s when Greenland got its first home rule agreement. The reason I stress this is not to take away agency from Greenland, because I find that's extremely important as a Greenlander, having worked in the Greenlandic Foreign Affairs Department as well. I find that's extremely important. The reason I stress it is that everybody who looks into this specific situation needs to know that there's an internal battle going on within the Kingdom of Denmark too, when it comes to not only this question on the US, but also all kinds of foreign security and defense questions. So now I'll just jump to the question of the Greenlandic population. The question of whether or not people were afraid is quite clear and relatively easy. The question or the answer is yes. Jonas was referring to having sort of a certain stake in this. I do believe that the population of Denmark was also anxious, but I can reassure you that the Greenlandic population were afraid that a military intervention was just about to happen. Specifically because a lot of the statements that came from various stakeholders and actors in the US came just the day after or 2 days after the intervention in Venezuela, right? So the the picture of being invaded was quite visual for the Greenlandic population at the time. So yes, people were afraid, and I would argue that people are still afraid, even though we haven't heard much talk about it lately. There's been a survey amongst the Greenlandic population about how they view a potential relationship with the US. And as far as I remember, about 85% of the Greenlandic people does not want to be a part of the US. So that's quite clear that the Greenlandic population has sort of made a stand on this specific question. There's always been an openness to cooperation with the US. I think the Greenlandic population, including governments and parliamentarians, know that having a relationship with the US is simply a condition. But how that relationship looks like, that's what we need to really figure out as of from today and going forward. When I look into sort of the political landscape of Greenland, I think it's important to distinguish between the parliament and the government of Greenland. So obviously, the government of Greenland does not want to be a part of the US. The day before the meeting in Washington, D.C. between the foreign affairs ministers from Greenland and Denmark, respectively, that you just referred to, Maria, there was a joint press conference between the Premier of Greenland and the Prime Minister of Denmark, stating loud and clear that Greenland is a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, Greenland is a part of NATO, and Greenland is a part of the EU and wants to keep it that way for now. So that is relatively clear. Looking into the parliament, they have issued a statement too throughout the parties of the parliament that states that the parliamentarians don't want to be a part of the US either. However, I would say with some nuances. And those nuances go to the fact that a lot of the politicians in Greenland want to strengthen their position vis-a-vis Denmark, right? The internal negotiations vis-a-vis Denmark, a lot of the politicians in Greenland actually look at this situation as a leverage to achieve more within the Kingdom of Denmark. And that's why I was eager to mention this Kingdom of Denmark legal framework, because a lot of the politicians in Greenland now see a possibility to enhance their decision-making powers, really, within the Kingdom of Denmark framework. So those are the nuances that one needs to look into when looking at the different parties in the Greenlandic parliament. And then there's a relatively populistic party in the Greenlandic parliament that they do oppose the behavior of the US within this administration vis-a-vis Greenland, but they're sort of flirting with the idea as well. So it's a little hard to know where they position themselves, other than they really want to use this position as a lever to achieve more within the kingdom and achieve more with Denmark. We can also see that now. There's just been a national election in Denmark for the Danish parliament. So basically, they're negotiating about a new coalition agreement and a new Danish government, really. And just today, the two new members from Greenland have been joining a meeting with the acting Prime Minister of Denmark about a new government for the future. And some of the agendas they come to the acting Prime Minister of Denmark with is really, we want to see a change when it comes to what we are able to do within foreign security and defense policies. That's been all over the Danish media landscape today. So you really need to take that into account as well. And that's why those internal dynamics, you don't see them a lot in the media coverage of this specific question currently, but they're sort of underlying in all that's happening. Now, turning to the EU, and I'm sure we'll have more time to discuss that when we start speaking about, recommendations and how can we move forward and all that. But I think it's been extremely heartening to see the allies who showed up when the Kingdom of Denmark needed it, and that's been definitely noted not only in Copenhagen but also in Nuuk. And it's been great to see that the EU, with whom Greenland has had a strong relationship with since 1985, when Greenland actually withdrew from the then EEC, has actually stepped up. So I'm actually currently waiting to know if the rumors about van der Leyen's coming visit to Greenland in April are true, and which I think they are. And when she does come to Greenland in either April or May, what kind of a package will she bring to Greenland? And I think definitely she will bring an investment package to Greenland that will, one way or the other, try to accommodate the notion of this state and private interest that we've been speaking about. So we can't only settle with political support. We need to also see military/security support, which we saw with this Operation Arctic Endurance. And then we also need to see investments going into economic development in Greenland. And there are maybe three overall things that you can support Greenland with regards to investments. It's the mineral sector, it's the tourism sector, and it's also the sort of hydropower/green energy sector. And I think one of the false premises that we've been working with when we've been speaking about mineral resource extraction is that we've been operating on market conditions. We haven't, because the Chinese have not been working with market conditions. And we need to understand that. And we need to also understand in that context that if we want to build a stronger economy, for example, within the mineral resource sector in Greenland, that also supports the supply chain of Europe, we need to intervene with some sort of investments. I think I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nauja. Thank you so much for drawing such a comprehensive picture, touching upon all levels, really, the local dynamics, the domestic internal dynamics within the Kingdom of Denmark, but also the variation if it's Greenland's parliament or government, and touching upon Europe, and then finally resources as well. I will come back to resources in a bit and recommendations for Europe. But Anna, thank you very much for your patience. You've heard now all the speakers, and Sweden is a friend and fellow Nordic neighbor of Denmark, and is of course a very strong ally of the US. And you are NATO's newest addition, if I can say so. But when you saw that assumably for the defense and security of Greenland, America needs to own territory, which created a massive rift between Washington and European allies, between Denmark and the US as well. What's the view in Stockholm, and what does that say about the alliance or our reliance on the US for defense and security, or even for the defense of Ukraine, if the prerequisite for defense and security is to own or control a territory? Thank you for sharing your views, Anna.
Thank you, Maria, and thank you to all fellow commentators here today. It's been really interesting listening to each and every one of you. Where should we start here? I mean, just coming back to the position of Sweden, we have been quite outspoken. We stand. We've been showing our support for Greenland and Denmark quite early on in this phase, and I'd say that for us and for many other Europeans, of course, it was quite of a shock hearing an ally and a trusted partner go about its ways as the current US administration has done. And also, I'd say the pace itself, which they are operating on, is a challenge. And the US is giving all of us a lot of things to think about all the time, and they're not behaving as predictable as one could expect. And this is a challenge for us, since this is also something which is important for us as partners to be able to have this trust and reliability from both sides, so to speak. And of course, as previous speakers also have touched upon, it's difficult to see the Greenland issue isolated in a sense. We've seen Venezuela, we've seen now Iran. And of course, these are different contexts and different events and different motivations from the US side. But at the same time, it's also a disruption going on many places and levels at the same time. And this makes it urgent for all of our democratic countries to find their own agenda and their own way to handle this when the US behaves not as it has done for such a long time before. So there are lots of these kinds of discussions going on, of course. But Sweden is a very active member within the alliance, the NATO alliance, and contributing in a wide array of ways. And this will be even stronger, I think, the Nordic contribution and the Nordic Baltic pillar for Greenland, Denmark, and for many kinds of issues that probably will arise. And I believe, just as Chris said here early on, that there is a risk that the US will come back to Greenland, even if it's not in the main focus at the moment, and there are constructive meetings going on. We should be prepared for a next round of attention to Greenland again. And there's also this window of opportunity now that we enhance the dialogue within the Nordic community, within the MB8, within the Coalition of the Willing, together with Canada, which of course the Nordic countries now are making more of a stronger latch onto, which is very important, I think, for the alliance as a whole as well. And it's important that we use this time, because it also, I mean, there's a risk here also that Russia and other adversaries, such as China, tries to use this against us. So we need to really put our attention to this at the moment.
Thank you, Anna. Chris, I'd like to come back to you. Just, you know, there is a risk that US comes back. We need to be prepared. But just to get the record straight, what it is that the US is after. And, you know, maybe it's Greenland today, but it will be another island in the Arctic tomorrow. Is it really defense and security? Is it the rare earths and minerals? Is it China and Russia? Or is it Trump's legacy? What is it that we, what is it really at the heart of it? Where would you put your finger?
I think it's a little simpler than that, Maria. And great discussion, everyone. Thank you, Nauja, Anna, and Jonas, and Maria. I think it's a little simpler than that, Maria. I think it is, first off, let's look back at Trump's first administration. He tore up the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico and negotiated a brand new one, which was almost the same as the previous one, right? So, and now he's prosecuting a war against Iran, and the most recent, you know, with changing objectives, but the most recent objective is, you look at the list of what he wants, it looks a lot like JIPCOA, which he tore up in 2018. So in a number of ways, you know, we look at the 1951 Denmark-US defense agreement. I think Trump likes to have agreements that he made himself that have his name on it, if I have to be very frank there. And so be it NAFTA, be it JIPCOA, be it this case, I want my name on it. It seems to be the trend, if I'm being very frank. And so let's not forget this administration, he started off bullying Canada. And so, and I think you look at the European, some of the responses to that, Trump started this administration bullying Canada, and the French sent a nuclear submarine to Nova Scotia, right? And so I think Europe being strong, united, ready to show force, as NATO did, as the French did in that case with Canada, I think, these kind of strong messages, strong united messages are so important. Because I think he responds to a couple things. One, he responds to the bond market in the United States, and he responds to people standing up strongly against him. And so I don't think this is I really, when I look at, especially at Congress, I don't think the Americans in general want this. This is something he personally wants. He wants a new agreement with his name on it. So because he likes to say he's a deal maker. I made a new deal with Denmark. It's so much better. And it might end up being, if I'm Denmark, I would just negotiate the exact same thing I had before. He'll think he won. But look at all the damage it's been done. Look at, it breaks my heart, Nauja, to hear what you're saying about, how people felt there. I'm a former military person myself, and I take this very personally like you do also, Jonas. I served in Iraq in a NATO mission alongside very professional, excellent, brave Danish service members. And when this started, it was heartbreaking. And so I feel you on that. So I think we need a strong response, united response. But we can't have a strongly worded letter. That won't work. And so I think at the heart of it, I think that's what it's all about. There's obviously the defense parts are ultimately solvable. I mean, they're so solvable because we have an existing agreement. And it's the existing agreement, as one person, a former negotiator told me, he said, Chris, we could drive a truck through it. You could do anything. The Danes have been very kind with it. The U.S. does not have sovereign bases anywhere in the world, anywhere. So, there was some talk of wanting sovereign bases. Maybe there's a little base envy because the U.K. has a sovereign base in Cyprus. I mean, that's kind of a special thing. But U.S. doesn't have sovereign bases anywhere. Why Greenland? Why now? So if I'm Denmark, I'm going to stand strong, offer the same agreement you had before, let him put his name on it in big letters, and we'll end up, we might end up in a good place. I also think Trump is so, I think the longer this Iran war goes on and the weaker he gets politically, I don't think he's going to have the juice left to come back to Greenland, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be ready.
Thank Chris. I wonder what Jonas and Nauja thinks about that. Perhaps Jonas, starting with you. Do you see it that way? Do you think that defense issues are solvable? That if you repackage the existing agreement and put a big stamp saying Trump, that would suffice? Do you think Arctic Sentry is already delivering or addressing some of the concerns, or is it deeper and something else we need to be prepared for?
No, good questions. I mean, I agree with Chris that the President Trump comes from real estate. He likes to see building that carries his name, and the same with countries and deals. There's also then from also having worked with him in administration the first period, there's also this huge spectrum where he's also willing to call something that's a very bad deal a good deal as long as it's his. So if you look what he did with North Korea in the first period, Bolton has his then national security advisor, has this very well depicted in his book, which I recommend, The Room Where It Happened. And Bolton is basically trying to block Trump doing anything on North Korea. And Trump ends up in the end of all these love letters between him and Chairman Kim going out saying, well, the world is much safer now. And of course, Bolton behind the scene is saying nothing happened on the North Korean nuclear weapons or anything. So I would say, again, I think I can see my own hand here. I would say there is a spectrum from Venezuela out here of being able to take out a dictator in Venezuela in 2 hours, the same time as sort of going to the movies on Saturday afternoon, which of course for Trump was very accelerating. And now with Iran, seeing how much military action is actually sort of complicated in the real world. So I do also think that Iran makes it less likely that we will see kind of the big territorial threats come back from Trump. I do also think the fact that there was opposition inside the US from 3 forces, I'm not, again, necessarily saying they're holding Trump back, but one, the population. This wasn't even really popular not even greatly among, I mean, a few of them are based, but it was, at least polling wise, this was unpopular in the US population. It was unpopular in the military. The question of whether would this be an illegal order or not to attack another NATO country and NATO territory that's covered by the Finch Treaty by the US itself. I mean, you could basically move outside the Pituffik base. By the way, it's the only base in the world of US bases that do not have a fence because it's so high up north. So you could just go outside the perimeter and put a US flag, and then what? You've conquered Greenland. So I mean, the way you would do it would also be kind of slightly odd when you already have, apart from when there are exercises, the largest military presence on Greenland is the US already. So in that sense, it's but again, I agree also with that we should stay prepared for sort of whatever comes next, and that it's not sort of anything that's gone. I have a sort of worst case scenario, which I now air here and haven't written in one of my articles yet. It's actually one for the Danes, which is where Trump says, yes, the base is going to be called Trump, and you have to pay for it, not sort of NATO, nor the US. And it's all going to be on your dime. And then suddenly you could make a new split inside the Kingdom of Greenland if Denmark suddenly was like, okay, this is a 70 billion that will sort of cost 5 super hospitals inside Denmark in order to build over the next couple of years. So anyway, that's just one of the things that I've been kind of looking ahead at in doing kind of worst case scenarios as well for. And with that, Trump could easily come to that because that's been the way he's negotiated bases around the other parts of the world, saying, well, you should pay for it. I mean, the fact that we're coming, we're there to help you. So he sees it more sort of the Swiss mercenaries, and therefore it's going to be on your cost. And I could see that introducing a new split into some of the really interesting things that Nauja pointed out about all our internal dynamics. And right now we have this kumbaya moment a little bit with Greenlanders and Danes standing very strong together. And I think some Danes, and now I'm being frank, that previously they maybe thought, okay, Greenland cost us money. What is this historic legacy? Do we still kind of need, because there's a yearly transfer? I think that is completely dissipated in the Danish political debate, and everybody's, why haven't we done more? Why haven't we done Arctic packages earlier and so on? But I could also see that turn around if suddenly Denmark stood with a huge bill to foot of sort of paying for a very increased US military presence. Over now straight to Nauja.
Yes, Nauja, indeed. There has been a shift within Denmark, and you alluded to it, but it has also been a shift within Europe. Now, Chris was saying we need to be united, we need to be strong, we need to take action. What would you like to see if indeed van der Leyen comes in April, if indeed EU is serious about Greenland and the wider Arctic, the High North being a strategic priority for Europe? What would you like to see in that package in terms of investments, in terms of which areas, and of course for the people of Greenland, and not just for the companies of fellow Europeans? Could you elaborate on that? Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you. I think first and foremost, on a very sort of political, holistic perspective, standing united is really, putting the Nordic countries together, the European countries, along with Canada, and maybe do some sort of middle powers alliance that Prime Minister Carney of Canada spoke about at the Davos meeting. So making sure that the great political powers of Europe, including Canada, stands firmly together, showing their support to the Kingdom of Denmark, also when it comes to security and defense matters. That would be sort of the fence around how can we develop the internal relations between, let's say, Greenland and Denmark more, Greenland and the EU. Yeah, so when van der Leyen comes to Greenland in the near future, I would like her to have an investment package that looks into not only supporting the current cooperation between Greenland and the EU, but also goes a little beyond that. And I mentioned before that there are really 3 development areas that you can look into. One is tourism, which is important within a Greenlandic economic development perspective, not so much necessarily in an international perspective, where the two others come into play, which are hydropower and the opportunity to actually develop green energy that could potentially / hopefully also be utilized in a European context. And then the second one is the mineral resource area, right? Because the EU has also, for the past, 3-4 years since they launched the Critical Raw Materials Act, has been working diligently to figure out how to supply Europe with critical raw materials and how to also support the development of an industry that can produce these metals and minerals that the European industry needs. Now, Chris mentioned earlier that, for example, when it comes to rare earth elements, we might be able to dig it up either in the US or in Greenland. But when it all comes down to it, the processing now takes place in China, because that's where they've built up that expertise while we've been busy in Europe just putting it away because it didn't fit our ESG and sustainability standards, right? So what needs to happen is that the EU, when von der Leyen comes with an investment package, needs to have thought through that whole value chain from, let's say, digging mineral X, Y, or C up in Greenland and looking into how does that create value in Europe, and where does the EU come in with support of investment or guarantees or loans to support that full development.
Anna,
can
yes,
I do a two-finger just on that?
absolutely.
Just to say how much I, also with my current hat as director of the Alliance of Democracies Foundation, I mean, we work to sort of strengthen cooperation among democracies, including that supply chains between, and I just think it's so important. We are so dependent on the Chinese when it comes to rare earths. So basically, we were so proud of how we think we got out of like the Russian dependency on oil and gas, but then we now have a huge dependency on another autocratic country. And I think Greenland there could become a sort of reservoir for the free world. Initially, both with the US and Europe, but I think now, of course, would be maybe more prudent to sort of bet on Europe on this, but also that we need kind of big public bets on it as well, because we do need price floors, we do need to think about state subsidies, we do need to think about long-term sort of delivery so that this can happen. Von der Leyen brought up at one of the last G7 meetings, she brought up this permanent magnet produced in Europe to sort of show the futures that you want, which is a rare one, or produced in the free world, because it was mined in Australia, had a Canadian component, and then we have a very small processing factory in Estonia for rare earths. So it's possible to do in Europe right now, but it's really at a small scale. And we need to sort of think very differently on that if we don't want our sort of over-reliance on China to get us into a worse situation that we were with Russia for the Ukraine war. So that I think in that sense, for me, Greenland also kind of fits strategically within that. And I do think as a Dane, we also missed the boat a little bit, that we didn't early on got our pension companies and others to make private or public investments. And we only started thinking about this when the Chinese wanted to build an airport and then blocked it and put in public money. So we shouldn't just do that defensive. We should do it way more proactively and saying it's time to kind of develop these things together. And I think that could also be the future for the Kingdom of Denmark, where the Greenlanders would naturally, if this all were to happen, become richer and have other opportunities, including the ones that want to seek independence. I don't think that would be a wise strategy as long as somebody like Trump or similar to Trump is near power, because I don't think the alternative to being part of the Kingdom of Denmark would be full independence, but would be some sort of forced recognition of a partnership with the US. But still, getting sort of the rare earths mined and into sort of European and democratic supply chain would be a great thing.
Thanks, Jonas. So indeed, it would be time, since Europe has neglected very much this jewel, so to say, of Greenland and the wider Arctic. But Anna, that would be a major challenge for Europe. How likely? So there is appetite, we hear from Greenland and Denmark, but how likely is it for Europe to come up with something like this? And I also wonder, how would this be seen by the US and Trump? If Europe comes in the midst of these trilateral negotiations, or would it be actually the right strategy for Europe to finally, stand up to Trump and offer a more lucrative deal to Greenland and Denmark?
Well, I think that in general, what Europe really needs to do at the moment is to align on its own narrative, because what we are dealing with at the moment is that we tend to react to whatever comes from the US at the moment, and at the same time we haven't been strong enough together in regards towards China, for instance. So we could have a common purpose here together with the US, also with regards on China actually. So there is potential, but we need to ground ourselves collectively within the EU and Europe, and really foster and have a more active counter-narrative and our own proactive narrative regarding Europe's interest. Because without that, we will face the same challenge over and over again. We will face the challenge of authoritarian states, which we need to have cooperation with at times for various reasons, and they will want to treat us individually as individual states, bilaterally. And we will also face a similar situation with the US, who now is somewhat more interested in dealing with European countries individually, as is also painted in various strategies where they speak about this matter over and over again. So we should not let ourselves be divided at this time. We need to be and act more collectively, because this is the best way forward for our future.
Thanks, Anna. And just with a bit of outlook perspective, this is all very much compounded by the climate change, because the question and solutions or adversaries here now, will only probably accelerate their efforts as the ice melts and, Greenland becomes more accessible, new trade routes open up, new shipping routes open up. There are even, perhaps demographic changes and looking into the future. Perhaps we only have 3 minutes, but starting with Chris, perhaps I can ask each and one of you, what in your view is the short-term but also longer-term outlook for Greenland and why the Arctic? And if you could make one recommendation for Europe, what would that be?
I think my recommendation would just echo what I've just heard from my fellow panelists, and that is, if Greenland is more integrated into the rest of Europe, into Denmark and the rest of Europe, for example, if Greenland is producing rare earth minerals and we are able to process them in Europe, maybe starting in Denmark, but elsewhere in Europe, we could tell the United States, hey, you sell us LNG, I'll sell you these, right? We can have sort of a transatlantic circular economy of things like this. I think the sooner we can get that on the table, the sooner we can make that happen. I think the more cards we will have to play, to borrow from a previously unpleasant conversation.
Thanks, Chris. Jonas, what about you?
I think Chris basically said it quite well. I agree with. I think it would be a strength. I would also maybe we should on both Greenland and EU side be audacious a little bit. Why doesn't Greenland become a part of the EU again? It's not even certain that you need, this gets technical and legal. Greenland could decide whether they need a referendum. The last referendum was actually a consultative referendum, so not necessarily legally binding. So you could even do it without a referendum. And I think that would be a great thing, combined with some very actual, because for the Greenlanders, the status that they changed was also very much based on fishery and other rights with the EU. So it should, of course, still be a good deal for Greenland, but combined with some of the economic deals we just talked about on rare earths and so on, I think that would make sense. Then it's also very clear that Greenland is both protected through NATO, through the King of Denmark, and through sort of being a full member of the European Union.
Nauja, what are your views on this additional layer of insurance?
Well, thank you for asking. Thank you for coming up with that comment, Jonas. I don't think there's an appetite from the Greenlandic side to become a part of the EU again. But let's leave it at that. I think, like the two others have mentioned, really it's a question of economic integration. and looking into that economic integration that includes investments and trade, right? Or that will follow from, at least trade will follow from investments going into the sectors where we can invest in Greenland. And having said that, I think it's really important. I applaud the EU for stepping up with regards to Greenland, but it really also includes that Denmark shows that it's willing to do the same thing. So looking into where can we invest, how can we work with price floors and ceilings, how can we work with state guarantees, can we potentially work with contracts for difference, and what can Denmark as the nearest state play a role with regards to that in and for Greenland.
Anna, that's what for you.
Yes, exactly. Yes, I think Jonas has a great suggestion there with the EU dimension if it is wanted. But then, of course, this could be applied to Iceland as well and Norway. So I think we should be thinking more of these kinds of structures which we are already in, and how can we apply and how can we enlarge and enhance our own strength here in this time.
And just to highlight, it always takes the first mover, right? And then you might have a chain reaction, which I could easily see happening in the High North. So with that, I would like to end our online policy dialogue. You've been fantastic speakers. I really appreciate your time. We managed to get so much out of it within 1 hour, and I really appreciate you all joining from the different parts of Europe, and I look forward to carrying on this conversation. We will reach out and we will come back. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of the week.
Thank you.
Bye.